My name is Anna Agshama-Abusa. I'm the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you today Timur Kuran, who is the professor of economics and political science, as well as the Gorder Family Professor of Islamic Studies at Duke University. Professor Kuran's work exemplifies what is best about multidisciplinarity. He shows how expertise and analyses drawn from economics, political science, and legal studies can together combine and give us insights that no single perspective could. His work has transformed our understanding of transitions to democracy and explained how regimes that appear totally quiescent can collapse overnight under the weight of popular protest. He has shown us why ethnic identity can be a powerful source of division and fragmentation in some societies, but not in others. And in other work, he has shown us why the caste system persists in India and why mass hysterias can arise. In his more recent research, Professor Kuran has turned to the institutional underpinnings of economic development, and specifically why and how Islamic institutions can prevent the kind of economic development through capital accumulation, strong civil society, and flexible organizational forms. For this rich body of work, Professor Kuran has received grants and awards from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the Earhart Foundation, and the National Endowment for Humanities. And so it is with great pleasure today that we welcome Professor Kuran to speak on the institutional roots of authoritarian rule in the Middle East, the Waqf as an obstacle to democratization. Thank you.
So, thank you, Anna, for the introduction, and I'm very honored to be here to speak again at the University of Michigan. I've spoken here in the past, and the exchanges have always been very lively, and I've greatly enjoyed the interactions. The Middle East is regularly in the headlines, and one reason is that its peoples are by and large dissatisfied with their government. States lacking legitimacy resort to repression as the conflicts play out. Major events make the news. The conflicts also draw in outsiders. Two global manifestations of the Middle East political troubles are the Iraq wars and terrorism conducted in the name of Islam. Sensational news provides a crude measure of the Middle East's political troubles. Various international indices have been developed to compare political performance systematically. The table you see on the screen is based on three of the most commonly used indices. Each shows from a different angle that the Middle East is politically underdeveloped. So in the second column, you see, based on statistics of Transparency International, that the Middle East is that the government in the Middle East is corrupt relative to the OECD, the club of advanced industrialized countries. In the second column, you see rule of law statistics based on World Bank indices. Again, the figures indicate that the Middle East is weak in terms of rule of law. The third column shows, based on Freedom House statistics, that civil liberties are substantially weaker in the Middle East. And of course, governments are, they also show that, or indicate that governments are relatively more authoritarian. Regional differences of this sort often have historical roots. In the case at hand, there has been a tendency to search for the roots of authoritarianism today in the history of the region's states. Scholars have looked to for resemblances between state structures in the past and those in the present. Now, of course, states have mattered. The dominant religion of the region, Islam, was born as both a faith and a state. That made a separation between mosque and state less likely. However, non-state institutions of the region have mattered as well. They've helped to determine the political capabilities of non-state actors, including their ability to constrain states. Democracy is a system of checks and balances. Where checks and balances are lacking, authoritarian regimes form more easily and they're more resilient. One source of the necessary checks and balances is civil society, in other words, organized associations between the individual and the state, where professional associations, political parties, neighborhood committees, think tanks, and other such associations are strong, the state is less capable of acting arbitrarily. If we see few democracies in the Middle East today, and if those that exist are new or unstable, we need to ask why checks and balances did not arise. The region entered the 20th century with a very weak civil society, one incapable of restraining state powers. We need to ask why. Before I suggest an answer, 2 points to put it in context. Civil society is not the only source of political checks and balances. Checks and balances can be built into the state itself. A division of powers, such as that of the American political system, serves the same end. In fact, every regime characterized as a democracy relies on some unique combination of in-state balances and civil society-based restraints. However, no known democracy relies on in-state balances alone, and for good reason. A strong civil society helps to make in-state balances self-sustaining, so we can't get to the bottom of why the Middle East is undemocratic without studying its civil society. My other clarifying point relates to the methodology of the work that I'm going to be presenting. Given that democracies emerged first in Western Europe and its offshoots in the New World, it makes sense to look to Western history for hints as to what may have gone wrong in the Middle East. Now, that does not amount to setting Britain or France or the United States as the model that the Middle East ought to have followed. Western countries followed multiple paths. Countries of the Middle East could have followed paths of their own. Yet, the Western paths share a common theme. Each involved centuries of struggles involving organized groups. Over many centuries, these struggles resulted in the expansion of freedoms as dominated, relatively poor, disadvantaged groups found ways to get organized and to do so effectively. So it's necessary to compare across regions opportunities to get organized in the pursuit of shared ends. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I want to suggest that an economically very important non-state institution of the past helped to delay democratization in the Middle East. Its legacy is responsible in important measure for the observed difficulties in the region in transitioning to democracy. And this institution is the Waqf, which is a trust formed under Islamic law. By Islamic law, I mean the Sharia, which was the law of the land in the Middle East until modern times. As with any trust, a Waqf has assets that are set aside to provide a particular service. In the United States today, parents can set up a trust to provide for a child's education. What makes a Waqf a distinct type of trust is that its founder must be a single individual. The trust must be managed by a single caretaker who can however, who can employ as staff. And the service is to be provided in perpetuity, forever, according to stipulations that the founder has placed in the Waqf deed. The Waqf is of interest here because it is the closest thing in Islamic law to an autonomous private organization. Being autonomous and having a budget of its own, it might have contributed to the development of political checks and balances. Now, the founder of a Waqf could be a state official. It could be a member of the ruling dynasty. It could even be the Sultan himself. The assets used to establish a Waqf could at one point have been state-owned lands. But once converted into a Waqf endowment, those assets that once belonged to the state were in theory and usually also in practice beyond the reach of the state. The land endowed as Waqf was thereafter to be managed autonomously by a succession of caretakers who got paid through the Waqf's income and not by the state. In any case, Waqfs were established also by private individuals who had no connection to the state. Now, before I turn to the Waqf's political consequences, let me give you a sense of its immense economic importance. And I think you're going to be seeing pictures of buildings. Every single one of them is a building, a still surviving building that was financed for centuries by a Waqf. So it'll help to make the point. And there'll be some buildings many of you may recognize. Until modern times, the Waqf was the delivery vehicle of a vast range of functions met in the West through corporations, which are self-governing organizations. The Waqf was the Middle East's alternative to the corporation. So in the Middle East, colleges called madrasas were financed by Waqfs. For example, the Al-Azhar College, which is still standing in Cairo, still influential, was established as a Waqf. There are properties, there are assets that finance its activities and have done so for a millennium. In the West, colleges were established as corporations, the early colleges, including Oxford and the Oxford and Cambridge colleges. They were self-governing organizations. For another example, practically all urban services in the Middle East until at least the middle of the 19th century were provided by Waqfs. In Western Europe, you had thousands of cities that had local governments, that had municipalities that provided the same public goods. The institution of the Waqf permitted individuals to supply, in a decentralized manner, a vast array of social services now commonly provided by governments everywhere in the world, including the Middle East. Any service compatible with Islamic law could be financed through a Waqf. In fact, Middle Eastern states left the provision of most social services to Waqfs. States provided law and order, and they controlled the military, and of course they collected taxes, but they did little else that modern governments do. They might build a road here for military purposes. They might invest in ports, again, for military reasons, but they did not, practically everything else was left to Waqfs. And this is evident in the old buildings you see in the major cities of the Middle East. Here's a picture from my favorite city, Istanbul, where I grew up. Every building you see here, with the exception of that building at the top with a red roof, which is the 19th century building, everything else was financed by a Waqf. So you have a bathhouse in the foreground for women and for men. You have a school in the center. At the very top, you have the corner of a mosque. The park itself was, for a couple of centuries, financed by a Waqf. And it's being maintained now by the municipality, but it's more or less the way it was, with the exception of the fountain you see in the middle. Now, was one of these two systems of delivering social services, including public goods, was one more efficient than the other? I'm referring to the Waqf system in the Middle East and to the use of corporations, mainly corporations in Europe. In the Middle Ages, the Middle East had several of the world's largest cities. So for a while, the Waqf system worked reasonably well. And we know this from travelers from Europe who went to the region. They marveled at the various services that were provided, mostly freely, sometimes for a nominal fee to the residents. It worked reasonably well, partly because the pace of technological change was quite low. European cities grew faster over the millennium from 800 to about 1800. And this suggests that over the long run, the corporation outperformed the Waqf. If you went to European cities and to Middle Eastern cities in the early 19th century, you would find the European cities to be much more orderly and controlling for various things like income. You would find the services to be delivered much better in Europe. Now, it is not controversial at all that up to modern times, Waqfs controlled very substantial resources. Unfortunately, we don't have many quantitative estimates, but what's available, or at least what's known to me, I've put in this slide. The figures that exist show that by the 16th century, perhaps even earlier, Waqfs controlled in the region roughly half of all real estate. That's all urban real estate and arable land, in some places more than that. At the bottom, you see the best studies, which use statistical sampling. They've looked at the share of tax revenues that were collected by Waqfs. Tax revenues were collected partly they were property taxes, but there were also poll taxes and taxes collected from merchants. So 27% of tax revenue indicates perhaps up to around indicates that about half of the land was controlled by Waqfs. I'm in the process right now of deriving estimates of the amount of land based on these figures there. But the point is that the Waqf was an economically very, very important institution. Evidently, Waqfs had the resources to supply an abundance of public goods to serve people all across society. They had the resources to provide employment and income to a large number of people. But the Waqf was also, even though in much of the literature it's presented as an instrument of charity, and I'll get to that in a moment, and as an economic institution, it was also a political institution. It became very popular partly for political reasons, and it contributed to political patterns characteristic of the Middle East today. Now let me develop these claims, starting with the motives for forming Waqfs. Property rights were insecure in the Middle Ages. Rulers expropriated private properties more or less at will when they needed resources. They were reluctant, however, to expropriate Waqf assets, and that is because founding a Waqf is something that you did under Islamic law, was considered a pious act, and assets placed in a Waqf were considered sacred. To prey on Waqfs was to risk developing a reputation for impiety. And in many of the great buildings that still survive in the Middle East from the Middle Ages, buildings up to the 19th century, you will see part of the Waqf deed or sometimes the entire Waqf deed literally carved in stone, as you see in the case of this madrasa, the gate of the madrasa, this madrasa in Iraq. And one of the things it says, either on this door or on one of the other doors of the madrasa, is that essentially that anybody who tampers with the assets of this building or anybody who damages this building or damages anybody working for this building, brings harm to them, will effectively go to hell. Okay, so that's, I mean, it's the fact that these organizations are sacred is actually people are reminded of it in the deeds and in various other ways, and of course through Islamic teachings. So to prey on Waqfs for a sultan was to risk developing a reputation for impiety, which wasn't good, of course, for if he wanted to stay in power. So private property owners endowed Waqfs to protect their assets. Now, why would people have wanted to shelter assets from the state if this required them to provide a service? Well, they must have received something themselves. In fact, the founder of a Waqf could appoint himself as the caretaker for life, and he would enjoy all the privileges that came with being a caretaker, including managing the resources. As a founder, he could set the caretakers, and therefore his own, if he was going to appoint himself, is his own compensation. He could place friends and relatives in various positions. He could designate his successor. Often he chose a child. So in setting up a Waqf, a founder didn't simply engage in charity, which is the impression you would get from much of the literature on the Waqf, the modern literature on the Waqf. This was a factor, but some of the secured income accrued to him, to his family, and to his descendants, and of course it was sheltered from rulers, and it was also sheltered from taxation. This is one of the major reasons why over centuries such immense resources in the region flowed into Waqfs. I mentioned that members of the ruling family could form Waqfs. Some of the largest Waqfs, like the one you see here, the Süleymaniye Waqf, was in Istanbul. These were founded by sultans and their wives. If you go on a tour of Istanbul, you'll be taken to the Süleymaniye Mosque. That's just the one component of the big charitable complex that Süleyman II built. Now, you might wonder why is the ruler building a Waqf, or why are members of the ruling family, why are they sheltering this from themselves? Well, they too gained something from sheltering Waqf from their own state. There were factions within the ruling dynasty. The mother of a prince might want an autonomous base for security in the event that a rival palace faction gained power. Also, financing a service through a Waqf gave that service immunity to changes in budgetary priorities. Waqfs built in a sultan's name would be secure regardless of his descendants' priorities. The Waqf is not among Islam's original institutions. It was brought into Islamic law in the 8th century as Islam was becoming a world religion through conquests and trade. The main beneficiaries originally were high officials who became wealthy through land grants as they conquered a lot of lands in the name of the Arab empires. Huge land grants were made to high officials. And these high officials who had a lot of land, looked for a wealth and tax shelter in the face of weak property rights. Rulers and most officials were Muslim by birth or by conversion, so the privilege of endowing a Waqf was given to them. The assets of a Waqf had to consist of real estate, at least at the time, which suited their needs, but not those of merchants whose capital was liquid. The rules of the Waqf were selected to serve the dominant elite, not the dominant religious community as a whole. No faith restrictions were imposed on beneficiaries. The beneficiaries of a Waqf, let's say a Waqf established hospital, could be Muslim, they could be Jewish, they could be Christian. So from the beginning, the chosen purpose of a Waqf had to be compatible with Islamic law. This excluded opposition to the state from the possible services. Now, putting all this together, the Waqf amounted to a credible implicit contract between rulers and private landowners. The state would not prey on Waqfs, and it would let founders and caretakers benefit personally from the properties placed in Waqfs. They would be exempt from taxation. The promise would be credible because of the sacredness of Waqf assets. For their part, Waqfs would deliver a service according to their deeds, and they would stay out of politics or specifically subversive activities. The no politics rule could be enforced through courts that, under the law, monitored the caretaker's use of assets, and their participation in politics was undermined also by organizational features that I will take up now. So by design, so let's look at the Waqf more carefully with an eye on its political implications. By design, the Waqf was a rigid institution. It was supposed to manage its resources according to the founder's instructions. Its assets were inalienable. They could not be sold or bequeathed or transferred. They were meant to be rented out for income that would then be used to provide the services, pay the staff, and so on. The Waqf was supposed to deliver services, again, according to the founder's instructions, which were set in stone, sometimes, as I pointed out, literally. The instructions were placed in a deed that was filed in court. In principle, the deed had to be followed even if conditions changed dramatically. Technologies changed dramatically, relative prices changed dramatically. You still had to follow those rules. The caretaker of a Waqf was not required to please his constituency. Who was his constituency? Who belonged to the constituency? The beneficiaries of the Waqf. He was not required to be responsive to them. He was not required to achieve any particular level of efficiency in using the resources. In principle, he did not need to please anyone except the judge who was responsible for monitoring his adherence to the deed. So the preferences of the founder, as interpreted by him and a local judge, trumped those of the beneficiaries. For their part, the beneficiaries had no right to demand adaptations. They were expected to receive services from the Waqf passively. And this is consistent with the logic of the system. The ostensible beneficiaries weren't asked in the first place what public good they wanted. The elites made the decisions for them. Now, this is a good place to compare in terms of flexibility the Waqf with the corporation that served their functions in Western Europe. So this diagram shows a two-dimensional space. On the horizontal axis, you have flexibility in asset management, going from zero to no flexibility to full flexibility. And on the vertical axis, flexibility in service delivery, again, going from 0 to 100. The default for the Waqf was that the caretaker had no discretion at all. In practice, founders did give them some choices, and they actually recorded in the deed that they were allowed, for example, to trade particular assets if the need arose once. Okay, so they were provided some selection. They were for educational Waqfs, they were given sometimes discretion in selecting a textbook. But but the default was if nothing had been mentioned and they started with a particular textbook, that was the court could interpret that to mean that that was the textbook to be used forever. Again, in practice, Waqf caretakers circumvented the rules they could. So they operated, so a Waqf like W1 would operate in practice in the space that's shown in the small red triangle. I'll come back to this. The default for a corporation was self-management. Now, of course, the corporation would have a charter that would define what it was to do. If the corporation was a city, it had certain obligations that it had to meet. It had to obey certain laws. The state might place covenants on the corporation that would restrain it in one way or another, as when cities are prevented from forming an army, for example. But the corporations tended to have more flexibility. Now, we'll come back to this comparison. Consider now a Waqf that is established to deliver a particular service, let's say primary education in a particular neighborhood, according to fixed directives. Suppose some beneficiaries want to alter the use of the Waqf's resources. They want more teachers hired, or they want teachers with higher qualifications or different qualifications. The system hinders the necessary collective action. The caretaker has no disclosure requirements. Beneficiaries are not entitled to information on management or on the budget. The beneficiaries have no discussion forum. There's no town hall. There's no annual meeting of users or of their representatives. To make matters even more difficult for beneficiaries seeking change, they do not participate in the selection of the caretaker. They cannot replace an unresponsive caretaker as one might replace an underperforming mayor. One study of Waqfs in a Turkish town shows that 70% of the caretakers, and it's a pretty large database, about 200 caretakers, 2,000 caretakers, about 74% died in office, and most of the remaining had been replaced by a son. Okay. Legal records give no evidence of caretakers being sued by beneficiaries for mismanagement. I've put together a pretty large data set from involving legal cases from 17th century Istanbul. There isn't a single case involving a lawsuit by beneficiaries against a caretaker. Now, this doesn't suggest that people couldn't sue officials. Almost one-fifth of the cases involving taxation involved lawsuits with the plaintiff, a taxpayer, a subject, and the defendant, a tax collector. So in spite of the huge importance of the Waqf in the economic system, and as I'm arguing now, the political system, and the huge importance that Waqf caretakers played in people's lives, they were powerless to influence the selection of caretakers. All varieties of democracy emphasize mass participation in one way or another. The Waqf's system of governance is at odds with this feature of democracy. It discouraged mass participation. This had long-term implications. People did not develop political skills or certain political skills, how to organize, how to communicate ideas, how to negotiate politically, how to treat a compromise as a step toward achieving one's end rather than a sign of defeat. This would have made it difficult, the lack of these skills would have made it difficult to build a democratic system in the future. And we've been witnessing this in the Middle East. Public discourse on social services would have been impoverished. If you don't participate in governance, if you can't affect the social services that are being provided, if you have no say in what public goods are provided and how they're provided, why develop ideas and why articulate them? Suppose now that in spite of the difficulties I've mentioned, a Waqf caretaker and the Waqf, the staff of working for him, and all the beneficiaries agree to lobby for some complementary service. Okay, let's say the previous obstacles have been overcome. The Waqf supports a school, and everyone who benefits somehow from the school wants a particular road built or road repaired, let's say. There are other Waqf-supported services in the area, a fountain, a hospital, a mosque. Their constituencies will also benefit from this road. These communities will achieve the goal, the common goal of improving road service or building a road. They're more likely to be successful if they form a coalition than if each acts independently without coordination. Unfortunately, Waqfs cannot merge their resources unless the founders have explicitly given authorization. And the founders would have had to think of this, in some cases, centuries earlier. They cannot form a super Waqf. In any case, Waqfs cannot engage in politics. I mentioned this already. A judge can block them if they spend their resources on politics. He can block joint activity on the grounds that it can give rise to politics threatening to the ruler. So in Middle Eastern history, we find no lasting coalitions among Waqfs. There were no federations of Waqfs or associations of educational Waqfs or regional Waqf associations. Nothing that would correspond to the coalitions that formed in Europe among cities that, of course, fulfilled the roles that Waqfs did. And no professional associations emerged either. If coalitions had formed, some of them may have gained permanence. After all, the Waqfs themselves were permanent organizations. They could have started a democratization process. Checks and balances would have emerged organically. Since the Arab Spring, Arabs have complained incessantly about how they're divided, how they can't form stable coalitions against the state. This isn't a new pattern. Historically, civil society has been very fragmented and atomistic. Let us return to our diagram depicting flexibility in the management of the Waqf and the corporation. Waqf services were not necessarily inefficient at their founding. So the Waqf that I'm representing here, W1, was not necessarily inefficient when it was founded, let's say in the year 1200. Okay. Now, Waqfs that were efficient initially, did become inefficient through time, which created, of course, incentives to circumvent the stipulations in their deeds. So suppose that Waqf W1 was founded to provide health services. 200 years later, because of new medical knowledge, it's no longer efficient to spend resources as the founder stipulated. It makes sense to adopt new technologies. It also makes sense to alter, say, the Waqf's assets. Not making the adaptations will result in deadweight losses. Avoiding the losses requires exercising more discretion than the founder authorized, moving, say, to W1 star. These adaptations made by the caretaker will appear as corruption. The same flexibility, however, is legitimate in the case of Corporation C1. The Waqf will appear as more corrupt and appear as more corrupt to everyone concerned for adjustments that its counterpart established as a corporation can make without raising eyebrows. Now, that's not to say that you can't get corruption in the case of a corporation, because the corporation also operates under certain constraints, and corporations, we know, try to push the limits and try also to break their own rules. But the types of adjustments that result in the perception of corruption are greater in the case of the Waqf than the corporation. Possible adaptations of the Waqf can also be categorized according to their welfare effects and the caretaker's personal returns. So I'm going to distinguish between three types of corruption here. A caretaker might take advantage of ambiguities in the deed. No deed, even one that is 20 pages long, will be a complete blueprint. There'll be ambiguities. And he can take a clever caretaker can take advantage of these to accomplish changes that are in the interest of the beneficiaries. And the judge responsible for monitoring the Waqf might not notice this, or he might look the other way, or just formally accept this as a creative interpretation of the deed. Okay? So that's corruption that is in that serves everyone. Secondly, as a second type, the judge knows, of course, that his authorization is valuable to the Waqf. He can exploit his veto power by demanding a bribe. And if the bribe is small enough, the Waqf will still benefit. In fact, judges did expect to be paid for their authorizations. They saw the payments as compensation for services that they delivered to society by examining the deed and rendering a judgment. Now, when the bribe could exceed the value created for beneficiaries, the caretaker and the judge could collude to make excessive transfers. They could also collude in raiding the Waqf's assets. The lack of public disclosure requirements and the lack of transparency, the only person entitled to look at the expenditures, examine the expenditures, examine the investments was the judge. This, of course, made this type of corruption frequent. Many Waqfs withered away through harmful adaptations. All three types of corruption were common. They all undermined the rule of law. They got people accustomed to breaking the law for routine managerial decisions. Types B and C, corruption types B and C, also harmed the legitimacy of Waqfs. They made them appear as organizations serving elites unjustly. Such acts contributed to what one may call a culture of corruption. Breaking the law became common and acceptable. Now, to a degree, we have widely accepted law breaking in every society. Jaywalking breaks the law, but there's a lot of jaywalking in the town that I live in, and I wouldn't be surprised if it happened here as well. But in the modern Middle East, circumvention of the law took place in many more contexts involving far more resources. Remember that the Waqf controls, these Waqfs control a huge amount of resources, and remember that they are established forever, which is going to require them sooner or later to make adaptations. Now, Waqfs were, and of course we see this culture of corruption living on in statistics today, Transparency International statistics. Waqfs were largely nationalized in the 19th century. I'll say a little bit more about this in just a moment. In closing, people were accustomed to bribing judges and state officials for routine management activities. They transferred the practice after the nationalizations to their dealings with officials, state officials. The officials who became state officials started working for state agencies providing services that used to be provided for Waqfs, were themselves accustomed to bribing. They were accustomed to bribing because they often received services from Waqfs. They knew caretakers and so on, and many of them had served Waqfs. One of the ways that states managed to push through the nationalizations is by providing bureaucratic positions to the caretakers, to allow them to allow the nationalization without making much of a fuss. They gave them positions, paid positions in the new agencies. A byproduct of this culture of corruption was to raise the cost of making and enforcing laws. Where laws are commonly evaded, it's relatively hard to get people to obey new laws. Since everybody breaks the law, the act carries no significant stigma and enforcement is costly. Consequently, laws that are enforced at low cost elsewhere don't get enforced. It's harder to get them enforced. Traffic regulations, rules against littering, tax laws are openly flaunted in the Middle East even today. This is partly because for centuries, circumventors of laws have enjoyed greater tolerance. Nepotism is common in the Middle East, much more so than in advanced industrialized country. This partly reflects the fact that the Middle East started the transition from personal exchange to impersonal exchange with a delay of several centuries relative to the West, but the Waqf was a factor as well, even for imperial Waqfs, and certainly for Waqfs founded by ordinary subjects. Benefits went disproportionately to the founders' family members, and control of the Waqf's management with all its privileges typically passed to a son of the caretaker. People who gained control of Waqfs were expected to help family members. They were expected to give them jobs. They were expected to bequeath privileges. That beneficiaries lacked a say in management is what allowed this. The traditional Waqf is now gone, but the pattern that it put in place lives on in Middle Eastern politics, sowing discontents where it is perceived as a source of entrenched inequality. So what happened to the traditional Waqf? In the 19th century, the formation of new Waqfs dropped precipitously. This is attributable partly to stronger private property rights across the region. Greater material security was demanded by foreigners who started settling in the region in large numbers, particularly in major cities and in centers of relative wealth, and also was demanded by religious minorities who were getting richer in the 19th century. As arbitrary expropriations became less common, the need for wealth shelters diminished accordingly. Two other factors were the emergence of alternative means for securing wealth. For example, bank deposits and new organizational forms for funding charity. In the mid-19th century, it became possible to establish, under special laws, corporations to provide services that had long been delivered through Waqfs. Of course, earlier formed Waqfs controlled half of all real estate at the start of the 18th century. Their economic inefficiencies became increasingly conspicuous in the age of industrialization, when the need to reallocate resources became increasingly pressing. So the region's reformers, starting with those of Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, took to nationalizing Waqfs on a large scale. In waves, nationalizations continued in the 20th century. Little resistance came from the constituencies of the old Waqfs because they saw them by then as very corrupt, and also there were better alternatives to the services they provided. Private companies and public agencies started supplying utilities, roads, education, and all sorts of other services, once provided exclusively through Waqfs. So the limits I've discussed and consequent corruption contribute to explaining why in societies where the Waqf played a significant role, political performance is weak by global standards. I'm listing here as the final slide some of the key problems. Two of these are ones that are measured through the global indices I presented early on. The roots of the problems listed here lie in significant measure, I've suggested, in an institution that was central to the Islamic political and economic system for a millennium. Social norms that the Waqf put in place were passed on from generation to generation. The Waqf also determined people's political and organizational skills, I've suggested. Those skills are learned through experience. The Middle East's late start in developing a functioning civil society stunted the development of these skills. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to questions and comments.